Dutch were more likely to develop trade relations with Native Americans than to settle permanently on their lands, and European settlement of indigenous lands in Canada occurred more gradually. English colonists, pushing inland from the Atlantic coast in what is now the northeastern United States, were more land-hungry than the French traders, since many of them hoped to establish new lives as farmers. In 1607, with the help of Chief Powhatan and his daughter, Pocahontas, the English founded their first successful American colony at Jamestown in what is now Virginia. However, conflict between Indians and colonists who wanted land to grow tobacco as a cash crop eventually destroyed the Powhatan Confederacy. Warfare between Native Americans and English colonists also occurred in the years after the Plymouth colony was founded in 1620 in present-day Massachusetts. Although these colonists were subsistence farmers rather than cash crop farmers, their desire for land sparked a series of conflicts that ultimately led to the destruction or displacement of many New England tribes. Colonial wars in the 1700s drew in many Northeast tribes on opposing sides. A long succession of attacks and skirmishes between the British and French culminated in the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. The Iroquois Confederacy blocked French efforts to control the waterways from the St. Lawrence River to the Great Lakes. The Mohawk, a leading Iroquois tribe, became firm allies of the British and helped defeat the French in Quebec in 1759. Many Northeast peoples, however, came to resent British restrictions on trade and British expansion west of the Appalachians. Beginning in 1763, a series of Indian attacks on British outposts swept through the Great Lakes country and along the Ohio River Valley. In an attempt to maintain peace, the British issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which guaranteed indigenous peoples all the land west of the Appalachians. Nevertheless, non-Indian settlers continued to cross the mountains in the wake of such explorers as Daniel Boone. During the American Revolution, pro-independence colonists tried to win the support of Northeast peoples by halting Euro-American settlement on Indian lands. However, Mohawk chief Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, and Seneca chiefs Corn Planter and Red Jacket persuaded 4 of the 6 Iroquois nations to join the British side. At the end of the war in 1783, the Iroquois ceded large tracts of land to the United States, and many Iroquois moved with their British allies to Ontario in Canada. Most Seneca, as well as smaller numbers of the other Iroquois people, remained on ancestral lands. Increasing non-Indian settlement in the Northeast pushed many of the remaining tribes westward across the Mississippi River and onto the Great Plains. By the mid-1800s, few indigenous peoples still lived in the Northeast. Those who stayed retained a small land base and became in many instances forgotten neighbors of the dominant Euro-American culture around them. Delaware, people. Delaware, people, Native Americans of the Algonquian language family and of the Northeast culture area. The Delaware originally resided in what are now the states of New Jersey, New York, Staten Island, Manhattan, western Long Island, and the west side of the lower Hudson River, eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware. The Delaware call themselves Lenape or Lenni Lenape, meaning original people. Europeans named them Delaware because they lived along the Delaware River, itself named after Thomas West, 3rd Baron de la Warre, 1st Governor of colonial Virginia, and its tributaries. The Delaware are sometimes known as the Delaware Confederacy because they were a loose alliance of Algonquian-speaking bands. Based on dialects, the various bands, each with a distinct political identity, are grouped as 3 divisions: the Munsee in the north, the Unami in the south, and the Unalachtigo along some of the Atlantic coast. Members of other Algonquian tribes held the Delaware in esteem and respectfully addressed them as grandfather because Delaware territory was considered the ancestral homeland of all. The Delaware developed trade relations with early European settlers and, according to legend, sold Manhattan Island to the Dutch in 1626. Some scholars believe that the group making the transaction was actually a band of the Wappinger tribe, which had villages along the east side of the Hudson River. European settlement on Delaware territory was rapid and led to some hostilities between the Dutch and Delaware bands in the region of New Amsterdam, now New York City. Although the Delaware sold much of their land to the Dutch and, after the 1664 English takeover of New Netherland. To the English, they apparently thought they were only selling the right to use the land, not the land itself. In 1682 Delaware bands, one of them under Chief Tammany, or Tamanend, signed a treaty of friendship with William Penn, the Quaker founder of Pennsylvania. Penn made several land purchases from the Delaware, generally on fair terms. With less and less land, and under attack from the Iroquois, the Delaware began to move westward. One group was converted to Moravian Christianity in western Pennsylvania and remained there. By the mid-18th century the main body of Delaware had abandoned their eastern villages and migrated to Ohio and Indiana. Subsequent stops were in Arkansas, Kansas, and Texas. By the 1860s some Delaware had relocated to the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, where they settled among the Cherokee. Others moved elsewhere in the West, joining other tribes, working in the fur trade, or becoming scouts for the United States Army. Like other eastern Algonquians, the Delaware were an agricultural people, growing corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers, and hunting and gathering to supplement their diet. They typically placed their villages along the banks of rivers and creeks, with fields of crops nearby. They lived in rectangular houses with domed roofs, similar to Iroquois longhouses, or in less permanent small domed wigwams. Marriage was accomplished through an exchange of gifts, and it could be terminated easily by either party. A Delaware chief, together with his advisors and the tribe's elders, selected the new chief among those who were eligible, based on matrilineal descent traced through the female line. The Delaware addressed their prayers to Manitou, the Great Spirit, or its many manifestations. An important renewal ceremony was the Big House, Gamy or Gomwing, which lasted 12 days and involved a log structure symbolizing the universe, the lighting of a sacred fire, and offerings to missing Halican, a legendary being who guarded game animals. The fur trade in North America. The fur trade in North America, trade in animal furs, generally conducted between indigenous peoples and Europeans in the northern part of the Western Hemisphere. The fur trade was a major economic incentive for European exploration. It involved trapping and skinning fur-bearing animals and then collecting the skins for processing into fur clothing and felt. When French explorer Jacques Cartier visited eastern Canada in 1534, he was greeted by members of the Mi'kmaq nation holding fur-bearing animal skins, which they seemed to want to trade. Even at this early date, long before the settlement of Jamestown and Quebec, visiting fishermen from France, England, and Spain had been bringing copper pots, glass beads, and iron knives and axe-heads to northeastern America and bartering them for furs. For the next 300 years, the fur trade would drive the exploration of North America, shape relations with indigenous peoples, and affect the history of empires. The French, who ruled Canada from 1608 to 1760, dominated the North American fur trade, partly because they occupied the St. Lawrence River, which gave access to the Great Lakes and the heart of the continent. The Canadian city of Montreal became prosperous as the main depot from which furs were shipped to Europe. Initially, indigenous people brought their furs there to trade, but soon itinerant French-Canadian fur traders called coureurs de bois, woods rangers, were paddling birch bark canoes westward in search of larger and cheaper supplies of beaver. Before the end of the 17th century, they had advanced as far as the Great Plains and linked the Great Lakes with the Mississippi River system. Renowned for daring and endurance, the coureurs de bois adopted native customs and skills and married into indigenous families. In time, the trade developed along regular capitalist lines as many of the independent coureurs de bois were reduced to working as hired hands for large fur companies. They continued, however, to blend French and indigenous elements in the way they lived. Meanwhile, the Dutch and English were also eager to share in the profits of the trade. Neither nation produced anything quite like the coureur de bois, as they preferred to wait for the indigenous peoples to come to them with furs. The Dutch and later the English traded with the Iroquois Confederacy from posts around Albany, New York. Traders from the New York and Pennsylvania colonies tried to break into the French monopoly of Great Lakes furs. Starting in 1670, the English Hudson's Bay Company pursued the business from the north, setting up posts at the mouths of rivers running into Hudson Bay and supplying them by sea from England through the frigid waters of the Arctic region. The English government granted the company a trading monopoly, and the power to make its own laws, over a vast region that came to be called Rupert's Land, now in north-central Canada. The French and English were bitter rivals in North America, fighting a series of wars from 1689 to 1763. However, the fur trade was not a major cause of the fighting. The rivalry between the two powers was worldwide, and they pursued the fur trade, sometimes at a loss, to maintain indigenous allies for the North American phases of their wars. The French were much more successful in this respect, and war parties of their allies conducted devastating frontier raids on the English colonies. Nevertheless, the French lost the wars, and Britain captured Canada in 1760. However, Montreal's dominant position in the fur trade continued after the British conquest. Merchants of British and American origin gradually replaced French entrepreneurs, while French-Canadian employees continued to crew the canoe brigades. As the trade pushed farther into the interior, transportation expenses mounted and soon the major operators were pooling their efforts, forming a cartel called the Northwest Company in 1783. At that time, the Canadian trade extended as far northwest as Lake Athabasca, separated from Montreal by 4,800 kilometers, 3,000 miles, of wilderness. Led by one of the owners, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, the Nor'westers later pushed on as far as the Arctic Ocean in 1789 and the Pacific Ocean in 1793. The Northwest Company's operations heightened competition. The cartel's inland posts diverted business from the Hudson's Bay Company because the indigenous trappers could now sell their furs much closer to home. By the early 1800s, the Nor'westers was also competing with American companies from posts they built in the Oregon Country, a vast land that was claimed by both Britain and the United States. The key to the success of the Northwest Company was a flexible, decentralized business organization and a finely tuned transportation system developed over a century by French-Canadian traders. Everything revolved around the summer meeting at the head of Lake Superior, at Grand Portage, now in Minnesota. Every spring, large canoes with crews of 6 to 12 left Montreal with up to 2.3 metric tons of imported merchandise and business correspondence. At the same time, smaller canoes with crews of 5 or 6 set out from posts scattered across the hinterland, carrying about 30 bales of furs weighing 40 kilograms, 90 pounds, each. They traveled quickly, resting at intervals for a brief smoke. Distance was measured in pipes, packing their heavy loads over rough portages, and subsisting mainly on pemmican bought from native buffalo hunters. At the Lakehead Rendezvous, there was recreation for the crews and a business meeting for the owners. Then the parties exchanged cargoes and went their separate ways. The furs went to Montreal to be shipped to England, and the imported merchandise went west to be traded for more furs. Injured by the competition from the Northwest Company, the Hudson's Bay Company changed its methods in the late 18th century and began extending its operations inland. After a period of intense and often violent conflict, the two companies merged in 1821, under the charter of the Hudson's Bay Company. The trade monopoly and power to govern that had been originally given to Hudson's Bay in 1670, were extended to all British-held territory west of Rupert's Land. The company dominated most of present-day Western Canada until 1870. American Westward Movement. The American Westward Movement was the movement of people from the settled regions of the United States to lands farther west. Between the early 17th and late 19th centuries, Anglo-American peoples and their societies expanded from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. This westward movement, across what was often called the American frontier, was of enormous significance. By expanding the nation's borders to include more than 3 million square miles, but this expansion also resulted in great suffering, destruction, and cultural loss for the Native Americans of North America. Before Anglo-American westward expansion, many other forces and cultures had shaped North America. There were hundreds of Native American tribes who had been living on the continent for thousands of years before any Europeans arrived. Many of these tribes disappeared because of the assault of European exploration and settlement. The French explored North America, first settling in Nova Scotia, Canada, at Port Royal in 1604, and then moving along the St. Lawrence River Valley where they founded Quebec in 1608. With the help of an inviting system of rivers and lakes, the French expanded rapidly into the interior. In little more than a century, they had established outposts along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, including Montreal, Fort Frontenac, Detroit, and Fort Mackinac. The French also built posts along the Mississippi River at Kaskaskia, Natchez, and New Orleans, and along the Gulf Coast at Mobile and Biloxi. Deeply involved in the fur trade, the French also reached as far west as the Great Plains and central Canada to bring manufactured goods to Native Americans in exchange for the skins of deer, fox, and especially beavers. Other nations were drawn to the continent as well. The Dutch established the Atlantic colony of New Netherlands, later renamed New York by the English. Swedes and Finns lived in small settlements in what would become Pennsylvania. England established its first Atlantic colonies in Virginia at Jamestown in 1607 and in Massachusetts at Plymouth, Boston, and other towns between 1620 and 1630. These first English frontiers illustrate two of the most common motivations for people moving westward. The first motivation was the hope of finding great wealth quickly through developing and trading the colony's resources. Jamestown was settled for this reason. The earliest dreams of mining for gold and producing wine and silk came to nothing, but in time Virginians found prosperity in the rich soil, especially by raising and exporting tobacco. Over the next 400 years, the economic motive, in particular the desire for good, cheap farmland, would be the most powerful attraction for people moving west. The second common motivation was the hope of practicing their religion without government intervention. The Puritan settlers of Massachusetts wanted to build a community based on religious ideas that were opposed by the British government. The frontier was home to dozens of colonies looking for freedom, religious and otherwise. One of these colonies in present-day Utah grew to become the home of one of the world's largest and most rapidly growing religions, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, whose members are known as Mormons. Those first Atlantic colonies also illustrated the contradictory roles that government played in westward expansion. The Puritans settled in Massachusetts with the permission, and sometimes the protection, of the same government whose policies they were trying to escape. Governments, first England and then the United States, always encouraged movement westward in a variety of ways. These governments bought or seized land from others and gave it away or sold it cheaply to emigrants. The governments used their military to protect settlers and financed developments, such as transportation, that made settlement easier. People heading west came to expect the government's aid and support. At the same time, settlers often resisted efforts by distant authorities to regulate how they used and lived on their new lands. From the first colonies to the final farming and ranching frontiers of the 19th century, this conflicting relationship between pioneers and government was a large part of the frontier story. The first Anglo-American frontier made up of the original 13 colonies spread westward slowly. The colonists wanted to remain closely connected to their mother country across the Atlantic, and they were hemmed into the west by the rugged Appalachian region, a series of thickly timbered ridges, valleys, and plateaus with few openings for migration. By 1750, however, parts of this first frontier were expanding rapidly. A variety of economic motives drew them westward. Fur traders in New England, New York, and Pennsylvania bartered with Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes for beaver pelts, which were in high demand in Europe for the making of beaver hats. Southerners reached to the Mississippi River and beyond to trade with Native Americans for deerskins. Some hunters and traders soon considered settling beyond the Appalachians to establish farms in country with rich soil and forests full of game. The most famous of these, Daniel Boone, worked closely with another familiar frontier figure, the land speculator. Land speculators wanted to make profits from buying land, selling it to settlers, and organizing settlements. Boone worked for Richard Henderson, a land speculator who dreamed of selling land in Kentucky, Tennessee, and western Pennsylvania. The English government, however, had mixed feelings about the westward movement. After Great Britain defeated France in the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, it gained title to eastern Canada, Florida, the Gulf Coast, and all land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. These new lands opened the way for British expansion. However, Native Americans of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley lashed out against the English in an attempt to preserve their independence, their land, and their way of life. With the Ottawa chief Pontiac as their most visible leader, the tribes waged a bloody and costly war. As a result, the British government decided to keep the white settlers apart from the Native Americans. It issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, banning all white settlement beyond the Appalachians and stating that only licensed government agents could trade with the Native Americans. Predictably, many colonists were furious. The proclamation proved to be one of the first of many conflicts between Britain and the colonists that eventually led to the American Revolution. Regulations, such as the proclamation, were nearly impossible to enforce because of the distance between the British government and the colonies. In the early 1770s, land speculator Richard Henderson, in violation of British law, negotiated with the Cherokees for permission to settle in Kentucky. He then hired Daniel Boone to lead a community of families out of North Carolina, through the Cumberland Gap, and up the Wilderness Road, an old Native American path that Boone had explored earlier. They founded the town of Boonesboro in the central Kentucky Basin. Other people sponsored similar efforts immediately west of the Appalachians, establishing settlements in Tennessee and at the headwaters of the Ohio River in western Pennsylvania, where the village of Pittsburgh grew up around the outpost of Fort Pitt. At the opening of the American Revolution, the Anglo-American frontier had breached this first mountain barrier, despite the British government's efforts to stop it. Within one long lifetime, it would sweep westward to the Pacific Ocean. The Old Northwest. After the United States defeated Britain in the American Revolution, the government of the new nation encouraged expansion even more than the British had. This encouragement can be seen in two of its earliest laws, the Ordinances of 1785 and 1787. The Ordinance of 1785 provided for the survey and sale of land in what became known as the Old Northwest, the region north of the Ohio River, west of the Appalachians, east of the Mississippi River, and south of Canada. This area encompassed the present-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. The Ordinance of 1787, called the Northwest Ordinance, forbade slavery in the Old Northwest, guaranteed English common law there, and set up a system of government that outlined how the territories could become states. The new United States government also paid Revolutionary War veterans by giving them the right to take land for free in the Old Northwest. Some took up the offer. Many more sold their right to land speculators, who in turn did all they could to encourage westward migration. At the same time, the United States government assured Native Americans living in the Old Northwest and in the land south of the Ohio River, called the Old Southwest, that their rights and interests would be protected. The two policies encouraging expansion while protecting Native Americans proved hopelessly contradictory. Several Native American tribes, including the Shawnee, Delaware, and Miami, united in a confederation to protect their lands against white settlement. They scored some stunning military victories against the United States. However, the Confederation was defeated by General Anthony Wayne at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. The Treaty of Greenville, signed in 1795, ceded much of the present-day state of Ohio to the United States. Other